And it's always a pleasure to come back to Raleigh Close. And I want to talk about anti-Semitism today. I want to look at the reasons for it. The reasons for it, that's interesting. Reminds me of a school. And there were 3 kids in the school at lunchtime, came back to their class, and their teacher said, "What did you do during your lunch break?" So there was a girl called Penelope there. "Penelope, what did you do at lunch break?" "Oh, I played in the sandbox." "That's really nice. If you can spell the word sand on the board, then I'm going to give you a lollipop." So S-A-N-D went up. She got a lollipop. Billy, what did you do at lunchtime?" "Oh, I played in the sandbox with Penelope, miss," said Billy. "Oh, great. That's lovely. If you can spell box on the board, I'm going to give you a lollipop," said the teacher. B-O-X. There you go. "And what did you do, Avi Goldberg, during lunch break?" "Well, I wanted to play in the sandbox, miss," said Avi, "but Penelope and Billy just threw rocks at me." "They threw rocks at you? That sounds like outright anti-Semitism, Avi. If you can spell outright anti-Semitism on the board." Jokes don't work on Zoom. Right, we'll get on with it. Hello, Rhett Hendon, are you awake? You with me? Good. I'm going to laugh at my own jokes. The book called Why the Jews, written by Dennis Prager and Joseph Telushkin, was published in 1985. I don't necessarily agree with those 2 authors on every issue, but they wrote a particularly good book. You can buy it on Amazon. I'm not getting a cut. But they looked for patterns in anti-Semitism. Why are the Jews hated? And they conducted a broad historical survey looking for the patterns of anti-Semitism. They wanted to explain the consistent presence of significant anti-Semitism amongst different populations. They looked at the why. They looked at how much hatred there was of Jews, where, under what circumstances, under what conditions, when did it happen? And they found that this most widespread hatred of human history had a unique persistence and intensity. And basically, I wanted to take this opportunity today on Shema, live and exclusive on Raleigh Close Sports 3, to share with you some of the insights that Prager and Telushkin came up with, and to add a bit of a religious dimension to their discoveries. So let's go on a journey together through time and space. Let's go back through the centuries, through the millennia, and analyze specifically anti-Semitism through the ages, where it was, when it was, how intense it was, and let's try and see the conclusions that could be drawn based on what we find, based on what Prager and Telushkin found and published in their book in 1985, entitled Why the Jews? The world before Christianity. Let's go back to the ancient world, the classical ancient world of antiquity, of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and ancient Egypt, first of all. In Egypt, there was a priest called Manetho, who was quoted and documented as saying that Jews were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. He admits this. But it was because the Jews were lepers, they were chased out of ancient Egypt. And this, of course, was the plague of the firstborn. And it was a plague, but it wasn't quite leprosy. This, we're talking about the 3rd century BCE. And Manetho, the poet of ancient Egypt, writes that Jews should be hated because of spreading plagues. Also, the ancient Egyptians thought the Jews were atheists. They accused us of atheism because we worshipped a God that was invisible. You couldn't bow down to it, you couldn't see it, you couldn't bow down to it, you couldn't touch it like a sheep or a snake head or anything else that they might have worshipped in the pagan times. And therefore, they didn't recognize this invisible God, and they accused the Jewish people of atheism, which was, in those days, an insult. So we look at ancient Egypt, you can see and analyze for yourself, based on the evidence, the nature of that anti-Semitism. Let's travel a bit further in time to 167 BCE, the Hanukkah miracle, under Greek rule in the land of Israel. You know that the anti-Semitism exhibited by the ancient Greeks and the Seleucid Empire was the first religious persecution for 1,000 years. There wasn't religious persecution in antiquity. And the first one that happened for 1,000 years was against the Jews. Why was there no religious persecution? Because when you went and traveled around ancient Mesopotamia or the Middle East, you would encounter different pagan faiths, different cults, and everyone, when they were in the place where they traveled to, they were in a new place, they would take on the religious practices and pay tribute to the gods that existed in that location. A bit like minhag hamokum. They went and they took on the minhag of the place they went to. So these gods were quite interchangeable. They didn't contradict one another. You bow down to the sea, we bow down to the sun. And when in Rome, bow down to who the Romans bow down to. And that was the way. But the Jews would not accept Greek gods. They wouldn't accept the philosophical legitimacy of polytheism and of bowing down to corporeal things, physical things. The Greek writer Appian actually accused the Jewish people of ritual murder and the use of non-Jewish blood for the matzahs. The first blood libel didn't originate in the Middle Ages in Christendom, but rather in ancient Greece. It's the first time we see the blood libel. So we've gone through ancient Egypt, we've had a look at ancient Greece. Let's travel to Rome as our Gregorian calendar begins 2 and a bit thousand years ago. The Romans at first respected the Jews. They had a lot of time for our religion and our customs, but once again, the Jewish recalcitrance to bow down to a foreign god of wood and stone got in the way, particularly in this instance with the Romans, our refusal to worship Jupiter, the planet Jupiter, the god Jupiter. And after persecution and ultimate defeat, our temple was destroyed. Beis Hamikdash was Nachareves, it was destroyed and torn asunder by the Romans. They destroyed the temple and sent the Jewish people into exile. They tried to outlaw Judaism like the Greeks before them, and ultimately it ended in a disastrous situation for the Jewish people. So if we take a look through antiquity, we do find an intense anti-Semitism based largely on the refusal of the Jewish people to bow down to the gods of others, to alien gods of wood and stone, of our refusal to indulge in paganism and polytheism. Let's move now in our time machine. If you're ready, if you had your coffee, you'll be ready for the time machine, a bit like me. This is my Liverpool cup. You can't see it, I'm blurred out. You can see that now. That is Kryptonite to Kenny Brand. Mazel tov. L'chaim. You're probably wondering what's in that coffee, but I can assure you it's just caffeine. Christianity. Christianity grew out of Rome. Constantine, the emperor, made the Roman Empire Christian in order to unify the empire, which was at that stage, in that time, kind of wilting and becoming disunified and eclectic through lots of cultures mingling and mixing, and the Romans were losing their collective empire identity. And to unite the Roman Empire, they were commanded by the emperor to embrace Christianity. We all know the chapters and verses of the New Testament, I'm sure. Matthew 27:25, the Jews are described as killers of the Messiah. In John 8:43 to 47, the Jewish people are described as devils. And St. John Chrysostom, who was one of the first saints canonized in Christianity, he described in his diaries his definition of a synagogue. He said it was a place that was akin to a brothel and a place of drunkenness and murder. He couldn't have been talking about the United Synagogue, but that's what he described a synagogue to be. And then, of course, the blood libels continued under the Christians when we were accused of taking blood for matzahs or poisoning the Christian population in their water supply. And Martin Luther, when Catholicism was challenged by Protestantism, Martin Luther, the progenitor of Protestantism, in the Protestant Reformation talks about, he talks about our misfortune. You know, the words unser Unglück that the Nazis used, that they described the Jews as our misfortune, those words were not originated by Hitler's men. The first use of that phrase was from Martin Luther hundreds of years before at the Protestant Reformation, and the Nazis used his phrase and employed it with their propaganda machine, calling the Jews our misfortune, unser Unglück in German. So to recap, we've looked at antiquity, we've looked at classical anti-Semitism as it manifested in Egypt, ancient Rome, and ancient Greece. We've looked at Christianity, at least at its inception under Constantine, and its development with the saints, with the Protestant Reformation, with Catholicism. Let's go to Islam. So the Jews under Islamic rule had a better time on the whole, with exceptions, than under Christian rule. But a lot of the Islamic opposition to Judaism was based on scripture. For example, in the Quran, chapter 4, 160, it talks about the Torah as being a punishment for the Jews. I have some sympathy with that claim. Who wants to put tefillin on every day? I don't know. Or who wants to fast on Tisha B'Av? Okay, I'm joking. They accused the Jewish people of removing references to Muhammad from the Bible, and they claimed that it was Ishmael and not Isaac who was taken for the Akedah. And they accused us of not being monotheists in various places based on various misreadings of our texts. And so there were many debates and oppositions caused by biblical argumentation, accusations about the falsification of our Bible. There were periods of systemic and systematic discrimination against Jews under Islamic rule, periodic expulsions and murders. The Jews were second-class citizens, made to pay special taxes and to wear different clothes. And that really summarizes the Jewish relationship with Islam until you look at relatively modern times with terrorist attacks, which is a relatively modern phenomenon. But that's a basic summary of the Jewish struggles under Islamic rule. Let's move to the Enlightenment. Maybe we'll find some friends there. I'm sorry to disappoint you. Voltaire, the lettered scribe of France, the philosopher, the writer Voltaire, at the head of the Enlightenment movement, he hated Jews. He accused them again of human sacrifice. This is an Enlightenment thinker. You look at what he wrote about the Jews, you can Google it, look at Voltaire. He said that Judaism was a revolting superstition, abominable. He writes, and I quote, "And to the Jews themselves, you seem to be the maddest of the lot. The Kafirs, the Hottentots, and the Negroes of Guinea," he says, "are much more reasonable and more honest people than your ancestors, the Jews. You have surpassed all nations in impertinent fables, in bad conduct, and in barbarism. You deserve to be punished, for this is your destiny." The words of Voltaire, ad can Lashonai. Mirabeau, 17th century French Enlightenment thinker, he said that anti-Semitism is so widespread that Jews must deserve to be hated. If the whole world can't be wrong, and therefore you deserve this. Fichte, the 18th century German Enlightenment thinker, said if you give Jews civil rights, they will trample over others, even though the Jews at that time were only 1% of the German population. So this type of paranoia is indicative of a hatred right at the heart of the Enlightenment movement, even though it's a secularist movement, and therefore their attacks weren't based on biblical scripture, which they rejected anyway. They weren't based on the rejection of polytheism. They weren't based on the rejection of their Messiah, but we see it with a new degree of intensity. Let's go to the left. Marxism. Marx was a Jew, didn't like that probably very much. He said the Jewish God is money, they are filthy, and they are lepers. The words of the enlightened Karl Marx. Fourier in 18th century France said the Jews are parasites and the emancipation of Jews is a vice to society. Proudhon of France again accused the Jews of poisoning the non-Jews and said that they should be sent to Asia or be exterminated. So this idea of mass extermination of the Jews was already being spoken about in the 18th century by leftist thinkers like Proudhon. So what we saw under Hitler was the manifestation of an ideology that was already prevalent across Europe. So what Prager and Telushkin did in their 1985 book, Why the Jews, that I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, was to take this historical broad survey throughout the ages and analyze the intensity, the prevalence, and under what conditions anti-Semitism lived and thrived so that we can make some conclusions. So they made some, before they made their conclusions, they decided to put some details on the record. They asked some questions. For example, why was there not so much anti-Semitism in the Far East or India? In Japan, there wasn't so much. There were some Jews there. They also looked at the idea of conversion. Now, if you're prepared to not be Jewish anymore and convert, then that was a way of avoiding anti-Semitism, apart from the Nazis. Under the Nazis, there was no way of opting out of being Jewish. And they looked at the relative strength of the hatred. So let's compare and contrast these different periods of time and the relative strength of anti-Semitism in those times. So what Prager and Telushkin did was classified it in this order. The least anti-Semitism was in the ancient world, Egypt, Greece, and Rome. And that, by the way, led to the destruction of our temple and many other things, but that was the least anti-Semitism. Then he says, the least anti-Semitism was the Enlightenment, because there wasn't violence or oppression. Then the ancient world was a bit worse, but not as bad. Then Islam, where you had some policies of persecution. Then the left, as we talked about Marx and the hatred that produced towards Jews. Then with greater intensity was Christianity, with the pogroms being described as devils, and ultimately an atmosphere that led to the Holocaust. The Nazis, therefore, are top of the tree, where you have a totalitarian fascist national socialism in Germany, really underpinned by the Amalekites, as we know. And that is the apex of our unfortunate and depressing table. Now, there are mistaken explanations for anti-Semitism, and this shiur was entitled The Reason for Anti-Semitism. Some people have tried to posit and proffer and suggest explanations as to why we find this hatred and why it's so intense and persistent. One explanation that is offered is scapegoats. The Jews just happen to be the scapegoats. So Prager and Telushkin reject this suggestion on the following basis. Why always the same scapegoat in every society? Why always the Jews? There might be the convenient scapegoat in 18th century Russia, but why also in the 1st century Byzantine and 3rd century Turkey and 20th century Europe? Why would the Jews be the scapegoats in good times when the economics were good? We see consistency through anti-Semitism in good times and bad. And for the Nazis, why kill the scapegoat? If you've got a scapegoat you can continue to blame for all the ills of the world, then why destroy and kill the person you're trying to blame and pin things on? Also, we know at the end of the Second World War, that's good coffee. At the end of the Second World War, the Nazis were prepared to send the trains and ammunition and the trucks with supplies to Auschwitz and to Buchenwald and for the trains leading to our destruction, rather than to the Russian border. And essentially, Hitler chose to kill the Jews more than to defend his own army. Why risk everything in World War II to kill the scapegoat? So it seems that this idea of scapegoat is not enough to understand anti-Semitism. What about economics? The Jews are accused of being the money lenders, the usurers, and therefore that's why we're hated. Well, that confuses cause with effect. The Jews lent money in Europe because they were denied other employment in the first place. Since the Christians took our Bible and said that when it says, don't charge ribis, don't charge interest to your brother, well, obviously it means your Christian brother. So the Christians weren't prepared to lend money on interest. And by the way, they weren't prepared to lend money at all, even without interest. So who's going to lend the money? Well, we'll make the Jews do it. We'll deny them access to the other professions, and they'll be forced to become this unpopular job of money lenders. Also, charging interest for lending money is not inherently immoral. Every single bank does it. Every single lender does it. Unless it's your family. You see, if you're going to charge if your brother asks you for a loan, most people would say you lend the money without interest. So it's not inherently immoral to charge interest. Money is a commodity. If I have to hire a car, hire a house, rent a house, I can also hire money, but at a cost. It's not inherently an immoral concept, and the world accepts it from Jew and non-Jew alike. So this idea that we're hated because we were money lenders doesn't seem to be at all convincing. It wasn't even our choice to become money lenders, and there's nothing inherently immoral about money lending. Hence, you don't find a universal hatred for every single lender who Nationwide, NatWest, wherever it might be, Barclays, you're not seeing them going to any gas chambers. What about Jews are rich? That's why we hate Jews. Jews are rich. Why were they hated when they were poor then? In 19th century, 20th century Poland and Russia, Jews had not been emancipated, not allowed to go to university, were poor in the shtetl, living a spiritual life, or not, as the case may be. And also, if we're hated because of money, where should we be hated the most today? The USA. Jews have vast wealth in America. Yet, that has not been the ultimate hotbed of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is a psychological disease. Now, that explains it. Well, I don't think it does. I mean, why would this disease be widespread? We don't find any other disease of hating a certain people. Why are they always the same object of hate? So all of these four explanations, these attempts to explain anti-Semitism, scapegoats, economics, Jews are rich, psychological disease, they don't cut it for me. And they didn't cut it for Prager and Tolushkin, who argued there is a correct explanation for anti-Semitism, namely, one second. There is a child protection and safeguarding conference, which is starting now with the United Synagogue. And I've just got one eye because that is a mandatory seminar. And that's why just looking over at that, Chief Rabbi is organizing that. So, but I'm with you for now, and we'll have some questions at the end. So what's the correct explanation for anti-Semitism? So Prager and Tolushkin say, Jews are hated to the extent that their ideology clashes with others. What Jews believe undermines other beliefs. And to that extent, there will be anti-Semitism. What are those beliefs? An exclusive God with a covenant with the Jewish people. A God who prescribes universal morality for every single human being. The idea of the Jews having this covenant and being a chosen nation to spread God's light. Exclusive practices like not marrying out or kashrut or any of our other laws that keep us separate. And the idea of the Jewish nation, so that we could be accused of having dual loyalties. And that existed even before the state of Israel. So the idea of having a national Jewish identity, the idea of having exclusive practices, the idea of the chosen people, and our belief in a universal morality underpinned by an exclusive, one, inscrutable, non-physical God, to the extent that another culture will clash with those ideas, is the extent there'll be anti-Semitism. And this explains a lot of the facts that we saw. In the Far East, we asked, why isn't there much anti-Semitism? Well, there were too few Jews for serious ideological competition in India and China. There weren't enough Jews for the ideology that they believed in to really undermine the host culture and the host ideology. The Enlightenment, let's go through different stages of history that we described. The Enlightenment, they thought that progress could be made through education, that Judaism is too primitive to survive, and therefore it won't be such serious competition. Therefore, they thought it would fade away inevitably, and the hatred was less intense than other anti-Semitisms. Then we went to the ancient world, Egypt, Greece, Rome. There was a certain liberalism of polytheism. As we said, everyone, swapped gods whenever they went to a different place. So there was semi-competition between Judaism and those cultures, but there wasn't so fierce. Islam gets a bit more intense because even though there were basic agreements about one God, etc., but there was competition for what the truth of the Bible was. Then we moved to the left, who held a violent political campaign because their ideology contradicted Judaism on many more points. Then we move to Christianity. There are various theological disagreements with the Christians, competition for the biblical truths, and a militancy against Judaism because Judaism complained that the Trinity is polytheism, it's idolatry. God is not three, God is one. And therefore there was even more intense anti-Semitism. And at the top of the tree, or the deep depths of the deep, Nazis and Jews. Well, it's a big compliment that our greatest nemesis is the Nazis. If the Jewish people are the number one public enemy of the Nazis, it says a hell of a lot about us. It is a huge compliment. We should take the compliment very seriously. But of course, the values of the Nazis and the values of Judaism were opposites. When I went to Germany, I went to Berlin with my community and we looked in Hitler's bunker, we found that there were two books that he had there with him. One was the Gemara Pesachim and one was the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, because he wanted to understand the ideology he hated so much. He wanted to target the essence of that belief system. So, diagnosis. Prager and Telushkin, again, men I don't always agree with, haven't agreed with, but in this particular book, I found it quite compelling. They conclude, as long as ideological competition exists, the potential for anti-Semitism exists. What are the solutions? Assimilation. We should simply give up being Jews. That seems a bit unfair. Social action. Well, that will be limited to a sympathetic society that is warm to our social action. C, and this is the crux. This is the suggestion about how to confront anti-Semitism. If anti-Semitism is caused by ideological clash between Judaism and other isms, then the way that we eradicate anti-Semitism is by making the world more Jewish. By persuading the world of the basic values of Judaism, not by conversion, but by spreading Jewish wisdom and ideas. We will eradicate anti-Semitism, or at least it will be lessened and diminished, if not eradicated. I guess there will always be hatred. The world has become a lot more Jewish over the last 3,000 years. Who hasn't heard of one God today? Who hasn't heard of the Bible? Who hasn't heard of Mashiach? Who hasn't heard of the basic understanding of the family values of Judaism? Maybe sometimes through Christianity and Islam, by the way, as the Rambam says, that those two religions have spread Jewish ideas all over the world. But if we make the world more Jewish and there is less an ideological clash between Judaism and other isms, we, by definition, reduce anti-Semitism. So we need to work with natural allies based on shared values and be able to articulate a Judaism that can bring meaning and ancient practical wisdom to people's lives. I wanted to conclude my rant today with a quote. I want you to guess who said this quote. Who has made us Jews different from all other people? Who has allowed us to suffer so terribly up until now? It is God who made us as we are, but it will be God too who will raise us up again. Who knows, it might even be our religion from which the world and all peoples learn good. And for that reason, and only that reason, do we suffer. We can never just become Netherlanders or just English or representatives of any country for that matter. We will always remain Jews. Who said that? Well, friends, Hendonites, that was from the diary of Anne Frank on April the 11th, 1944. So anti-Semitism is unique amongst all the hatreds of the world for its longevity, universality, its intensity, and the confusion about why it exists. But if we take our broad historical survey conducted by Prager and Telushkin, it'll help us understand what might be a solution to ameliorate the problem. The Gemara in Shabbos, Talmud, Tractate Sabbath, folio 69, or Daf Samach Tes Balaz, cites the source of anti-Semitism using a play on words. Because the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, and the Gemara says that when you pronounce Sinai, it sounds the same as sinah, hatred. The great sinah, the great hatred aimed at the Jew, emanates from Sinai. At Sinai, the Jews were told there is only one God who makes moral demands on all of humanity. At Sinai, the Jewish nation became the target for hatred by those whose strongest drive it is to liberate mankind from the shackles of conscience and morality. At Sinai, we were appointed to be light unto the nations. But there are those who don't want the light. They want darkness. And the call to Sinai was the call to transform the world. One second. 1 second. As I said, I am dealing with this. Okay, we're going to have to wrap up very, very soon. I am being called by the chief rabbi to join the seminar. Let me just put it this way. V'hisha Omda. This has stood. In every generation, they rise up to try and exterminate us, but God saves us from their hands. V'hisha Omda. This has made us stand. Stand. Well, that sounds counterintuitive. Can anti-Semitism make us stand? Well, maybe it will remind us who we are. I've told you many stories about my own encounters with anti-Semitism. It's something which is deeply troubling, but can also be an amud, amada, v'hisha omda. It can make us stand and seek the truth and to spread the light and actually to become what we were meant to be, the light unto the nations. If we become the light unto the nations and we make the world more Jewish, you can guarantee that there'll be less anti-Semitism. The broad historical survey that we discussed is available for all who want to look it up. Sorry to having to curtail this year. I did explain to the organisers before there was a risk of this because of the timing, but I hope you've enjoyed the 40 minutes we spent together, and I hand it over back to Kenny. Sorry, Kenny, for my being called away.
Very good.
Okay.
He's not there. A very clear analysis.
Thank you very much indeed, Warren.
Sorry, that was my fault. I didn't unmute. Rabbi Hughes, thank you very much for joining us and giving us of your time. It's always a pleasure to have you back in Raleigh Close. And we hope we'll have you back in person, giving a share in Poshma, actually on the premises in due course.
Please, God, thank you all for coming this morning, and I will see you later. I do have to run.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Can I make one observation to the group, even if our guest speaker has to leave?
Sure.
And that is that whereas I personally agree with everything that's been expressed, I don't think the conclusion is effective and right, because I believe that what we're witnessing and why we're to a certain extent benefiting from current scenario is because there has been a general decline in Christianity observance, if you see what I mean, in some countries, and a recognition that there's something called a Judeo-Christian ethic or morality, which is again beneficial and desirable. But you witness in those countries, and you mentioned the word stand, I keep thinking in the word stand. Wherever you see a country with the way it ends up in stand, which is basically an Islamic country, you will find that we are unfortunately heads of the spectrum.
It's not there. No, it is.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure, Warren. I think what you're looking at. Yeah, I'm talking. I think it's an anthropological phenomenon. The Jews are the quintessential outsiders. They are different. And in places like the Far East, where they look different, there's less problem than in the West, where they blend in to the rest of the population. You don't know, as you go through London or New York, who is the Jew unless they are wearing identifiable clothing. And you'll find there's often more respect for those who are identifiably Jewish than those who blend in, sorry to use the same words again, with their surroundings. There's a fear of the other that I think permeates every society, and identifiable others are in a different position to those that cannot be identified. I remember being some years ago in a gathering of very English people, and I was talking to someone, and Jeffrey was like on the other side of the room, and I think this man's wife was talking to Jeffrey, and he said, "Oh, he's Jewish. Yes, my wife is very good at sniffing them out." And it was this, it was this sort of veiled identifying of the other.
Yeah, but there are plenty of others which one doesn't like one for a reason or another, but do not necessarily provoke the kind of potential violent reaction. I think as given by is it Rabbi Hughes, was it?
Yeah.
The key element here, to my mind, is that Judaism, taken in its proper form, potentially undermines societal values and beliefs, particularly when they are actually structured on Christianity or Islam, for example. Where, in other words, it's what Judaism potentially represents, and that's why I suspect that ultimately, if you have any serious attempt at reconciliation with with Christianity or with Islam, it is always going to fail, because we are at fundamentals in conflict. And it's only when people are relaxed and actually don't treat their religions particularly seriously that you can actually have a society which can get on with each other, even though there might be dislikes. But nevertheless, we can live quite comfortably with the other, whoever the other is, providing they're not actively threatening our way of life. At the moment, the only threatened way of life, if you might suggest, ironically, is coming from the liberal democratic views, particularly when it comes to issues like homosexuality, and how the BBC thrust down our throats the fact there are other alternative lifestyles, and how they want to thrust this onto our children. It's all that kind of thing which actually now, currently in this country, for example, and in America to a certain extent, reflects what is truly trying to undermine society. We go back 50 years, 100 years, then Judaism itself, in its terms of its values, falls in that category.
I'm not so sure, Warren. I think I keep thinking about what is the current view of Israel, that it's perfectly okay to be anti-Israel and anti-Zionist, and that's being used as a cover for a lot of anti-Semitism. And yes, the world has become more secular, but so have the Jews become more secular.